Are you finding it difficult to stay strong as a Christian because your life is hard right now? Do people sometimes give you a hard time because you're a follower of Jesus? Are you struggling financially? Do you sometimes wonder where God is when life gets tough? Do you need hope for the future? Well, welcome to the Busy Christian Podcast. Yes, welcome to the Busy Christian Podcast with me, Steve Griffiths. If you're watching the video podcast on YouTube or whether you're listening to the audio podcast on your own preferred platform, then you are more than welcome today. Now, this is our fourth podcast in our series on the book of Revelation. We're doing a really deep dive into this most incredible book of the Bible. And we're working through it almost verse by verse to discover the amazing truths that God has in store for us through it and to receive his comfort and his encouragement in some very difficult times. And today we are looking at Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 to 11, which is the letter from Jesus to the church at Smyrna. And we're going to see that when we do go through really difficult times, there is hope for the future, and there is the promise of God's presence with us as we go through our struggles. Now, in the first two episodes, we thought about the context into which Revelation was written, and we thought about its purpose. So if you haven't already checked those out, then it would be really useful for you to watch episodes 1 and 2, or listen to episodes 1 and 2 if you're on the audio podcast. And then today, as we did in episode 3, the last one, when we looked at the church at Ephesus, today we're going to look at the historical and cultural context of the church in Smyrna. And then after we've done that, we're going to move into the text itself and see what God wants to say to us through it. So without further ado, we're going to get straight on with it today and think firstly a little bit about the city of Smyrna itself and the cultural context into which this letter was written before we can then apply the biblical teaching to our own lives. Smyrna was a really important city. We thought in the last episode, if you listened to that Ephesus was hugely important in the Roman Empire. Well, Smyrna, the city of Smyrna, almost rivaled Ephesus for its prominence within the Roman Empire. It was probably built in the form that John knew it when he sent his letter, this letter of Revelation. It was probably built by Alexander the Great in about the 4th century BC. But it had been inhabited for thousands of years before that because Smyrna was built on the mouth of the river Hermus. And the river Hermus went deep inland, and so it was a key trade route for that area of Asia Minor, or Turkey as we know it today. And there was a beautiful temple there to Athena that had been built in the 7th century BC. And it was a very attractive area to live in. And many refugees had settled in the city of Smyrna over the years. And so there was a huge refugee population. There were beautiful landscapes surrounding the city. Every direction you looked, it looked absolutely stunning. And within the city itself, there were some magnificent buildings. There was a gymnasium, there was a stadium, there was a theatre, and there were 2 harbours there as well. And Smyrna was most well known for its extraordinary town planning. It had very wide streets, and the streets had pavements on them, and the roads were all built at right angles to each other so that they formed blocks of buildings. It was an architectural wonder, really, in that day and age, to have such an established city built on a block system for its design. And about 200 BC, there had been a huge political upheaval there, and the citizens of Smyrna looked to the Roman Empire for protection and for governance. And in order to persuade Rome to look favourably upon them, they developed a cult worship of Rome. The city of Rome itself became an object of worship in Smyrna, and that was personified in the goddess Roma. But alongside that, there was a very strong Jewish population as well. And out of that Jewish population grew the early church. Now, that was probably as a result of Paul's ministry. You may know that the Apostle Paul was very instrumental in church growth in the Asia Minor area. And in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 19, we're told that Paul went to Ephesus, which was only a few miles away from Smyrna. And he gave public lectures in Ephesus for 2 years. And in Acts 19, verse 10, it says this: all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. So it's likely that the church in Smyrna that grew out of the Jewish population was in no small, to no small extent, a product of Paul's lectures in Ephesus just down the road. And interestingly, when John's letter, the book of Revelation, arrived at the church in Smyrna, there was a member of the church who would later become extremely famous. And his name was Polycarp. And Polycarp became the bishop of Smyrna in the early to mid 2nd century. And Polycarp had a really profound impact on the shaping of the early church throughout that whole region. Now, Polycarp was an intensely godly man. He was a man of great prayer. He was a wonderful pastor. But as an old man, Polycarp was martyred in AD 155. He was sentenced to death and burned alive at the stake. But as he was put into the flames, he was given one last chance to recant of his Christian faith. And the words that he said at that moment have gone down in history. This is what he said when they said to him, "A final chance to recant and save your life." He said this: 86 years have I served Jesus, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my King who has saved me? Do to me what you will. Isn't that brave? Isn't that incredible? These early church martyrs have got so much to teach us about the power of faith and confidence in God. And that's an extraordinary example, isn't it, of somebody who was so devoted to Jesus that there was no way he was ever going to recant of his faith. And so Polycarp was thrown into the flames, but the flames didn't burn him. So the authorities, sadly, had him stabbed to death instead. And the blood of Polycarp, the testimony of Polycarp, had an immense impact on the growth of the early church in that region. Now, if Polycarp was 86 when he died, that would suggest that he was about 27 when this letter from John arrived to the church of Smyrna. So maybe Polycarp was the leader of the church, or maybe he was just a member of the congregation, and this letter from John inspired him towards full-time ministry. Who knows? But the church at Smyrna was clearly in the midst of quite severe persecution. And these words from John, this letter, this book of Revelation, were read by the man, Polycarp, who was to die that horrendous saintly death as a result of his faith some years later. And I'm sure that the book of Revelation must have had a deep and profound impact on him. Okay, well, let's turn to the letter itself and see what it is that we've got to learn from it. What does God want us to take from it? But before we do that, if you are finding this podcast useful, or if you're finding this series of podcasts useful, then please do hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're following the podcast on an audio version, then please do follow the channel as well, and that will help this podcast and all subsequent podcasts reach more people. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate it if you could like, subscribe or follow. Now, when we get to the letter itself, it opens in verse 8, chapter 2, verse 8, with a description of Jesus. It says this: "These are the words of him who is the first and last, who died and came to life again." Now that is a fascinating description of Jesus, and its aim is to bring comfort to a church that was suffering persecution. Now let's break it down into two parts so you can see exactly what I mean. Firstly, Jesus says this: "These are the words of him who is the first and last. Now, this is the third time in 2 chapters that Jesus has referred to himself in this way, as the first and the last. In chapter 1, verse 17, he'd said, "Do not be afraid, I'm the first and the last." In chapter 1, verse 8, he said, "I am the Alpha and the Omega." Now, we've thought in previous episodes about how this kind of description, this self-definition, if you like, from Jesus signifies authority and power and sovereignty, that all knowledge and wisdom and power are sort of contained within God. They're housed within God. And for the Smyrnians struggling against persecution, it's an important description of God for them to hear, that in the midst of all their suffering and all the uncertainty of their lives at that time, God is the ultimate power and authority, and he will prevail. No matter what their struggles were, God would have the last word. And we so need to hear that for ourselves, don't we? Because when we're going through difficult times ourselves and everything seems uncertain or chaotic in our lives, we need to know that in the midst of that, God will prevail. But secondly, in this description, his all-powerful nature is proven by the fact, as he says in verse 8, "I died and came to life again." Now, this is a really important statement. I came to life again. Now, bear with me just for a moment as I explain this a bit. Jesus says, "I came to life again." Now, the way this is phrased in the original Greek emphasizes the act of coming back from the dead, not the fact that he is still alive. It's the actual act of resurrection that's being stressed here in the original Greek. It emphasizes the historical truth of the resurrection, of being resurrected from the dead. What Jesus is saying here is that the resurrection actually happened. It was a moment in history. He was dead, and now he is alive. He lives again. Death did not have any power over Jesus. Fact. Now, you might say, okay, well, Steve, we have seen in chapter 1, verse 18, that Jesus had said, "I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive." But actually, when Jesus says that, that's in a different Greek tense. So in that verse, Jesus is making a different point. In chapter 1, Jesus is stressing his continued presence with them. But here in chapter 2, his point is different. He's telling them that no matter what they suffered, death has no power. It has been defeated in one moment, in one physical act of resurrection. Now, that was really important for the Smyrnians to hear because they were suffering persecution. They were facing martyrdom. For Polycarp, he would go on to be martyred, and maybe many others did as well. And Jesus, in this verse, is convincing them of the historical reality of the resurrection, that death isn't the end, that there is a reality of new life after death. So no matter what would befall them, even if they had to die for their faith, they would live again. Now, that's an amazing promise for all of us, isn't it? God willing, none of us will ever have to face martyrdom, but the promise of resurrection is so important. Death isn't the end. After we've died, we will live again, enjoying an eternity in heaven with God. Well, let's move on from this introductory description of Christ here, and we'll go to verse 9, which says this. Jesus says this, "I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are still rich." Now, the Christians in Smyrna were really suffering. And the first thing that Jesus notes here is that they were in poverty. And the word he uses here in the Greek for poverty means sort of extreme poverty, abject poverty. And poverty is a terrible, terrible thing, isn't it? In our current times, there are so many people who are struggling with it. You know, we are suffering globally with economic turmoil, and so many people are being forced into poverty across many, many nations around the world. And poverty really matters. It hurts. It can destroy lives. It can destroy mental health. It can destroy relationships. It can destroy societies. So poverty is a terrible thing. So Jesus says, I know your afflictions. I know your poverty. But Jesus makes an important point here, where what he's saying in this verse is that if we are suffering poverty, then we are drawing close to Jesus Christ, who himself lived in poverty. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, Paul writes this, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." So Christ forsook his riches, his wealth, and he became poor for us in order that he could take our material poverty into himself on the cross and share his spiritual wealth with us. So Jesus says through John, I know your poverty, yet you are still rich. And then he engages with the physical situation of the Smyrnians, which was the root cause of their poverty. He says this, I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, this is how it was for the church in Smyrna. The Christians in the city were being slandered by some of the Jews in the city. They were slandering the good name of the Christians, telling lies about them, and therefore making it really hard for Christians to get jobs or to buy food or to run businesses or participate in any level of civil life. And this slander was causing economic hardship for Christians. Hence Christ's comment in verse 9, I know your affliction and your poverty. But nevertheless, it seems quite harsh, doesn't it, for Jesus in verse 9 to call them a synagogue of Satan. My goodness me, that is a strong phrase, right? So why does he use that phrase? Well, we're going to be thinking about the nature of Satan in more depth in future episodes. I don't want to get too sidetracked on it now, because there's going to be plenty of opportunities over the coming episodes in this series to really go deep into who Satan is. But just in this context, to say that the word Satan, the name Satan, literally means slanderer or accuser. When Satan is mentioned in the Old Testament, in Job and in Zechariah, he doesn't have any authority. He is subordinate to God. And then throughout this sort of Old Testament period and in the pre-Christian era, the understanding of who Satan is evolves and it develops. And in the New Testament, God uses Satan to inflict suffering or punishment, as in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 5. In 1 Thessalonians 2:18, Satan hinders the progress of the gospel. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 10, we're going to come on to it at a later date. Satan is an accuser. In James chapter 4, verse 7, Satan is not a fighter. If we resist him, he will flee. And we're told in 1 Peter, verse 8, that he goes around like a roaring lion looking for people to devour. But we're also told in 1 John 3, verse 8, that Jesus has destroyed his work. And again in chapter 12, verse 12 of Revelation, that his time is limited. So we're going to kind of unpack all that at a later stage. But at this point, just to notice that the name Satan, the word Satan, means slanderer or an accuser. So that's why in Revelation 2, verse 9, those who slandered the Christians in Smyrna were linked by Jesus to Satan. Now, we might wish after this description of their trials and their temptations and the attacks of Satan upon them, that Jesus would then go on in this passage to assure the Christians at Smyrna that their suffering would soon be over. But actually, he doesn't do that. In verse 10, he says this, "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer." And then he gets more specific. He says, I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Now, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? 10 days of persecution. But of course, as we've come to realise, the book of Revelation is a book of metaphor and symbols. And of course, the number 10 has its own special symbolism. So what does it symbolise when it says they're going to suffer persecution for 10 days? Well, in the Bible, the number 10 often represents a sort of indeterminate period of time, an unknown period of time, a non-specific period of time. For example, in Genesis 24, verse 55, we've got the story of Rebekah and the man who wanted her to go with him. And Rebekah's brother and mother say, let the girl remain with us 10 days or so. It's a kind of non-specific time period. And so here in the book of Revelation, it says that their suffering will go on for a period of 10 days. It's an indeterminate time scale. It's just going to go on. And Christ isn't actually saying how long they are going to suffer for. But what he does do, however, is assure them that there is a reward waiting for them at the end of their suffering. In verse 10, he says, be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Now, actually, I think that accords with our own experience, doesn't it? It certainly accords with my experience in life and my experience of faith over the last 4 or 5 decades. All of us, in one way or another, have endured tough times in our lives. You might be going through one right now, and sometimes we have periods of really intense suffering. And we don't know how long that period is going to go on for. It's an indeterminate time. It's a 10-day period in our life that the problems just pile up, or they don't ever seem to get any less. And we just think, how long, Lord, is this going to go on for? But we do know from the promises of Scripture and from our past experience of God in our lives that there is an end to our struggles. There is an end to our suffering. There is an end to the problems we go through. And that at the end, there is a reward waiting for us if we endure with patience and with faith. And here in Revelation 2, verse 10, Jesus Christ tells them that they will inherit the crown of life. Well, what does he mean? Well, I mentioned earlier that 2 of the key architectural features of Smyrna were its gymnasium and its stadium. Now, Smyrna was proud of its sporting tradition. And in the Olympic tradition that went right back to ancient Greece, the victor in the games was given a crown made of laurel leaves. That was the prize for winning. That was the prize for endurance. That was the prize for standing firm and defeating the opposition. And the Smyrnians, with their beautiful gymnasium and their wonderful sports stadium, knew all about the crown of victory. And of course, it's a biblical idea as well. Paul writes in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5, if anyone competes as an athlete, he does not receive the victor's crown unless he competes according to the rules. In 1 Corinthians 9:25, he says, everyone who competes in the game goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Now, what is this everlasting crown that is being mentioned here? Well, Christ tells us in Revelation 2, verse 10, I will give you the crown of life. Now, this may be eternal life in heaven. Perhaps that's what he's referring to here, or there's certainly an inference of it. But I think as well, he's talking about a quality of life in the here and now. In John 10, verse 10, Jesus says, I have come so that you may have life in all its fullness. And I think there's a mystery here that can only be understood in the light of Christian experience, actually. that in some mysterious way, our sufferings in life somehow make us more mature, and they give to us a depth and a quality that we would not have if we had not suffered. Now, that's not to say that we should seek out suffering and hardship. That would be ridiculous. And anyway, suffering and hardship always seem to come and find us, right? But we do acknowledge that through the pain we experience, we somehow become more whole as human beings. In the first chapter of his letter, James wrote this: "Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete." Now, perhaps that is what is being promised to the church in Smyrna, that somehow through their trials and their tribulations, through the suffering and the slander that they are being called to endure for that indeterminate period of time, however long it was going to last, they would become mature and complete. Through the pain that they were enduring at that moment in time, as horrendous and unjust as it was, there was hope for the future, fullness of life in the here and now, and eternal life beyond the grave, granted by the one who died and came back to life again to prove that death has no more power over us. And I think that is our experience too. It's certainly something that resonates in my own heart. Like you, I've had a tremendous amount of suffering in my life, losing people at very young age who I've loved very much indeed, sickness, employment problems, financial problems over the years. Like you, I've had a great deal of suffering. But when we suffer difficult times in life, as tough as it is at the time, when we look back at those experiences, more often than not, we see that we have become stronger through the pain. Now, we don't want the pain, and God doesn't inflict it on us, but God, I believe, can redeem the suffering in our lives, and he can use the sufferings that we go through to build us up as human beings and to build us up in the faith. So if you're going through a tough time right now, there is no promise in this scripture passage about when your pain will be over. But there is a promise that God will walk with you through your pain, and that he can use your suffering to strengthen you as a human being and increase your faith. As much as we hate pain, it can be redemptive. We just need to look at the cross of Jesus Christ to realize that the ultimate moment of agony, the ultimate moment of suffering and pain, resulted in the ultimate act of redemption. And Jesus then concludes this message of encouragement to the Smyrnians in verse 11. He says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death." Now, certainly, each one of us will face the first death. We all die. We know that. But if we stay strong in our faith, if we commit our lives to Jesus as Lord and Saviour, and we live in the power of his Holy Spirit working within us in a relationship with God our Father, then we cannot be hurt by the second death. In Jewish mythology, the first death is what we all go through as human beings, but the second death is reserved for those who cannot escape its power, for whom judgment results in annihilation. But for those who remain faithful to Christ, despite our sufferings, we will receive the crown of life. We cannot be hurt by that second death of judgment. Death has no more power over us because the power of death has been conquered by Christ. I think I used this phrase, was it in the last episode or the episode before? This beautiful phrase, the death of death in the death of Christ. Not my phrase, John Owen, a wonderful 17th century British theologian. The death of death in the death of Christ. So if you are going through real struggles right now, whatever they may be, then this passage actually is a beautiful message of hope and consolation. And it's one that I hope will give you real encouragement that whatever you're going through, and for however long it's going to last, Christ is with you. He has defeated death. He knows the troubles you face. He will walk with you through those troubles. And there is waiting for you on the other side the crown of life. Life in all its fullness here on earth, and an eternal life with our Father in heaven. So stay strong. Cling on. If clinging on by your fingernails to your faith is all you can manage right now, that's okay. You don't need to do any more than that. But cling on. Stay strong. There is light at the end of your darkness. Well, thank you so much for giving me your time today to listen to this podcast. I hope you found it useful. If you have, as I say, please do click the like button, subscribe to the channel or follow the audio podcast. That'd be fantastic. And I will be back with you again very soon for the next episode. We're going to be moving on to an equally fascinating passage, chapter 2, verses 12 to 17, which is the letter to the church at Pergamum. So I really look forward to being with you again soon. Again, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today. So this is me, Steve Griffiths, on the Busy Christian podcast channel, wishing you all the best for this week and until we are together again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.